According to Merriam-Webster, oleaginous is the #1 searched for word today. That means our next guest, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist George F. Will, sent America running to the dictionary with the first lines of his column today. The column is entitled, "Trump is no longer the worst person in government," and it begins with this: Donald Trump, with his feral cunning, knew. The oleaginous Mike Pence, with his talent for toadyism and appetite for obsequiousness, could, Trump knew, become America's most repulsive public figure. Because his is the authentic voice of today's lick-spittle Republican Party, Pence clarifies this year's elections. Vote Republican to ratify groveling as governing. George Will documents the vice president's groveling and his hypocrisy. An example, George Will writes, quote, "Pence and his retinue flew to Indiana for the purpose of walking out of an Indianapolis Colts football game, thereby demonstrating that football players kneeling during the national anthem are intolerable to someone of Pence's refined sense of right and wrong." George Will juxtaposed that with Mike Pence's cozying up to the convicted and Trump-pardoned criminal Joe Arpaio, writing, quote, "Pence, oozing unctuousness from every pore, called Arpaio another favorite, professed himself honored by Arpaio's presence, and praised him as a tireless champion of the rule of law." George Will noted that Arizona speech by Mike Pence, quote, occurred 8 miles from the home of Senator John McCain, who could teach Pence, or perhaps not, something about honor. In his column, George Will quoted a speech delivered by Abraham Lincoln after the murder of an anti-slavery newspaper editor by a pro-slavery mob. Lincoln said, "There was a mobocratic spirit among the vicious portion of the population. So let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation." George Will went on to say, Pence, one of evangelical Christians' favorite pinups, genuflects at various altars as the mobocratic spirit and the vicious portion require. George Will sees an important difference between Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Trump is what he is, and Pence is what he has chosen to be. Here are the closing lines of George Will's column. Trump is what he is, a floundering, inarticulate jumble of gnawing insecurities and not at all compensating vanities, which is pathetic. Pence is what he has chosen to be, which is horrifying. George F. Will join us next. Tonight in Indiana, the president and vice president said this:
"We support law and order, and we support the heroes in law enforcement. They're great."
President Trump promised to stand with those who serve on the thin blue line of law enforcement.
Joining us now, George F. Will. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. And George, it was so striking to hear the president and vice president say that tonight when this president spends what history might show ends up being a majority of his days attacking the FBI, which I believe is in the business of law enforcement.
It is, but the president has an almost cheerful disregard of contradictions. If you just keep saying things, people will not notice.
And your point about, to borrow a phrase from another setting, Donald Trump seems to have been born this way, but Mike Pence has made a choice.
Well, Donald Trump is an open book who's been reading himself to the country for 30 years. There are just no mysteries left, and he is this, as I said, this jumble of insecurities and partially or not at all really compensating vanities. He's a kind of mistake of nature, and he is what he is. But Mr. Pence, who has signed on to this, You know, the vice presidency is not an office that has a high dignity quotient at the best of times. But to sign on for this and to go out to Phoenix and to praise Arpaio, to pronounce himself honored, this wouldn't be so bad if Mr. Pence were not the darling of the evangelicals. Mr. Pence is a kind of combination between Elmer Gantry and Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep was the Dickens character, was forever pronouncing himself humbled about this and so very humble about that. If you're going to be, as Mr. Pence has decided to be, conspicuously pious and conspicuously moral, then you have to watch where you're planting your feet, because there are mines all over the ground.
And George, you sent the country rushing to the dictionary today, created the most searched for word. And so I would like you to define oleaginous for the audience and tell them why you chose that one for Mike Pence.
Oily. Yes. It's in one word. That's kind of word when I'd use a word in my children who are in the college application business. I'd say it's an SAT word. Look it up.
Yes.
And I'm glad to see that the country did this today. Well, it means oily, kind of greasy, sort of just too smooth for comfort. Again, the sense that one fears that Mr. Pence by now is surface all the way through. And it's not a pretty picture. Again, he has signed on for this. When he first began to sign on to Mr. Trump, he used to always define Mr. Trump as this good man. What would a bad man look like?
You have watched Mike Pence certainly since his congressional career. Are you surprised?
I am surprised. He was a congressman of conspicuous bravery on occasions, voted against, in spite of astonishing pressure, he voted against the Medicare Part D because it was unfunded, and this was a good conservative principle he stood up for. Opposed No Child Left Behind because he thought that this was federal intrusion on the quintessential state and local responsibility. He was, in short, a person of discernible ideology. Well, he said goodbye to all that, and he's now going to do whatever the audience in front of him wants and expects to have done, which is why it was so shocking what he did in Arizona with Arpaio. Because when he said, I'm honored to have Arpaio here, he was really saying, look, politics now is entirely tribal. Our tribe has Arpaio on its side, therefore I'm on Arpaio's side. And it's very, very dispiriting.
George F. Will, thank you for sending the country once again to the dictionary for an SAT word, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Glad to be with you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.